Is it this camera that I'm looking at?
No, you're looking at me. We're going to have a conversation this way.
Mano y mano.
Yeah, exactly.
I like it.
Exactly. So, all right. Day 2 of the podcast, live at VIVE. This morning, we are excited to have Joe Blundo from TCV on the podcast with us. Joe, welcome.
Adam, good to be with you.
It's very nice to see you. We had a nice time last night.
We did.
Good. You had fun?
I did.
Awesome. So you're a partner at TCV.
I am.
Tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us about TCV and sort of what your role is there.
Awesome. So TCV is a growth equity investment firm, been in business for 27 years. We're currently investing out of 2 funds. The first is a $4 billion pool of capital, which targets making investments in companies sort of Series D and later. And then a brand new, what we've branded the Velocity Fund, which focuses on what we refer to as expansion stage opportunities. So sort of companies Series A through C. And we exclusively focus on technology. And recently, we've got quite a bit of momentum, humbly submitted.
And Velocity?
And Velocity,
okay.
Investing in the healthcare industry. So we're investors in a company actually just out in Coral Gables called Kipu, which is an addiction treatment EMR software platform.
I met them last night. It's a great company.
Paul and Rick. And then around the Thanksgiving timeframe, made an investment in a company called BenchSci, which provides software for preclinical research, productivity-related activities to big pharma. And then it's not yet announced, but we did make an investment recently in a company that provides automation technology for providers. So we're excited about that one as well.
When's that announcement coming out?
I believe in the next couple of weeks.
Excellent. As a physician and a former clinician and physician executive, having come to Silicon Valley 2.5 years ago to sort of join Syllable, and I've just been like learning from a fire hose about not just about technology and startups, but the whole financing piece of it. So when you say TCV pre-Velocity was in later stage Series D companies, why start backing up? Why start looking at earlier stage companies?
Yeah, I think selfishly, as the individual that spearheads our healthcare efforts, the entire healthcare industry from a technology perspective is rather early. If you think about it, ubiquitous adoption of electronic medical records, I mean, on a relative basis, that was like the other day, right? Only a handful of years ago did we achieve really what amounts to ERP adoption specific to healthcare, right? And so I think as a derivative of that, we launched the Velocity Fund, frankly, so that we could back and partner with entrepreneurs, management teams, and highly innovative companies serving industries like healthcare, among others, where we have a high degree of conviction in their opportunity, and we can support them at an earlier stage, as well as from the same firm at later stages as the opportunities present themselves.
How did you get involved in TCV and venture investing?
Sure. So I began my career as an investment banker with a firm called Harris Williams. I was based in Boston, where the technology group was based at the time. And that was in the early 2010s, sort of immediately post-high-tech act. And so folks were adopting electronic medical records at the time, and somewhat fortuitously joined the firm as its healthcare IT practice was really taking off. And so actually a couple months into my tenure at Harris Williams, TCV was looking for someone to spearhead their healthcare investing efforts and look no further than the firm that was showing them a lot of high-quality deal flow. And so I had heard of TCV. I wasn't intimately familiar with the firm, but took the job, and the rest is sort of history.
That's great.
Since I guess late 2014 was when I joined.
Wow. So when I came up with the idea for this podcast and came up with this title, Can Silicon Valley Save Healthcare? I mean, it obviously sort of pokes fun at a fundamental question within healthcare, which I ask all my guests, is we hear a lot when you listen to the news or you pick up the newspaper about all the problems within healthcare.
Yep.
We know that it's expensive. We know that the outcomes aren't exactly what we want it to be.
Yep.
So some people will say healthcare is broken. Do you think healthcare is broken?
The short answer is no. Quite frankly, I believe it's hard to characterize something as broken when you observe our healthcare industry developing a vaccine to combat COVID-19
Right.
as fast as we did. If I look at the sort of the other side of the spectrum or a different category, look at the innovation in the biopharma, biotech industries, just relentless, and some of the more innovative therapies that are increasingly coming to market are really remarkable. And then I'd be remiss if I didn't also indicate that, in the provider realm, what our industry is able to do from a treatment perspective within a single episode of care is also quite innovative and dare I say, bleeding edge. What I would say is that there are a number of ways that the industry needs to improve and be rendered more efficient or better. And I'm a believer that the adoption of purpose-built technology, specifically software, is one way that the industry can achieve that aim.
How do you view the adoption of that type of technology?
Where we are focused, we're focused on specific business processes and workflows where there are manual paper-based methods that are currently being performed, with good intentions, but rather inefficiently, where software can help organizations scale those efforts, render them, again, more efficient, more productive, facilitate things like data sharing at scale. And so we believe pretty strongly, particularly in the provider ecosystem, that will become increasingly important. I would argue it already is and has been for a couple of years.
So as you walk around a trade show floor like this and you see the hundreds of companies that are getting involved in the digital space, that are already involved in the digital healthcare space,
Yep.
and you think about how healthcare performs either in the back office or in the front office, there is a lot of interest, there's a lot of buzz, there's a lot of, I don't know if it's momentum. I guess that's the question. It seems like there's a lot of activity. Is there a lot, in your viewpoint, is there a lot of outcome? Is there really, because to me, adoption seems to be the thing that's lagging. The ideas are out there. The entrepreneurs who want to execute on the ideas.
Yep.
The investors are really excited about it.
Yep.
But then when I look at what frustrated me as a physician executive was the will of my colleagues to really want to move this technology into the forefront.
I used to work with a colleague who was fond of saying in the healthcare industry, from a technology perspective, it's easy to conflate momentum with speed. And that's always stuck with me in the sense that, you do attend a trade show quite like this one, and there's a lot of innovative companies and a lot of investment activity and even technology-enabled services firms trying to solve problems, pain points, et cetera, for this industry. And yet, if you open up a quarterly filing from a public healthcare company, pick your provider segment, they're talking about things like patient bed days and length of stay, right? Not necessarily bundled payments, right? And so that has always stuck with me. What I do think, and look, COVID was a horrible experience. Let's sort of start there.
Yeah.
I do think that there is some credence to the notion that this time it's different, in the sense that the healthcare industry across all subsegments was kind of exposed from the perspective of, I think it came to the realization that there are certain things that the industry cannot do that are not sort of readily achievable that ought to be. And so, I'm hopeful and an optimist by nature, but I'm hopeful that it did serve as a catalyst for technology adoption in order to solve some of those pain points.
From a personal standpoint, you probably could have chosen any industry to be an investor or to be a specialist in. Why'd you choose healthcare?
Healthcare for me is deeply personal. I think we were chatting a little bit last night as it relates to some of my personal and my family and friends' experiences with the industry and how that motivates me as an investor in this category. I think it sort of boils down to a passion that I have for my job and hopefully my participation in solving some of these problems by backing entrepreneurs and innovative technology companies. And then I also think that from a personal perspective, although this is not necessarily what you asked, I'm fortunate to be a relatively young, not so young anymore, a healthy individual whose interactions with the healthcare system are, annual physical, blood test, perhaps refill a prescription. And so a lot of times I apply my lens and perspective to some of the friction points that I observe. And I do that because I can only extrapolate as it relates to the experiences of those that have more complex needs and more frequent interactions with the healthcare system,
Right.
and what they might be experiencing if I'm experiencing those friction points. And oh, by the way, I am an investor in the category for a living. And so theoretically, I'm sort of advantaged in that respect. And so you can only imagine what others might be experiencing. So the punchline is I do apply that lens and some of that perspective as it relates to the potential for technology to solve some of those problems.
Has there ever been a direct link from a healthcare experience that either you or a family member has had and an investment that you've made?
Not to this point, at least not one that's announced. What I would say is that the friction points can be rather simple. A good example I often use is, at your last annual physical, of the percentage of time that the doctor was in the exam room with you, were they facing their computer or were they facing you? And that's not necessarily a pain point, but it impacts the experience that patients have with the healthcare system. And so I think about little things like that, right? Or, you go to refill a prescription. How many phone calls did it take to your provider to send the order to CVS or what have you? How many phone calls to CVS, right? Maybe you signed up for their text alerts and the text alerts didn't get delivered, or they were inaccurate, or you had a question. All things therein. And so, I think those experiences will manifest themselves in an investment that we did complete once it's announced.
Is this entrepreneurial, venture-backed industry, does it really have an opportunity to make significant change, or is it just going to be incremental change because of the difficulty of dealing with the healthcare industry writ large?
So I answer a slightly different question. I personally believe the answer is yes, but I think that the companies that are best positioned to do so approach the healthcare industry in a way that's open-minded, with respect, and with humility and empathy. I'll tell you a quick story, and I realize I am playing to the home crowd
That's
here,
all right.
but
We like
when I did one of my first interactions with Cobus, the CEO of Syllable, I remember him telling me a story about one of your early customers, and there was some reluctance on the part of the physicians to allowing Syllable's technology platform to answer inbound phone calls, rightfully so. And I remember, sort of continuing on with the story, Cobus indicated that in response, he didn't say, "You guys don't get it," or he didn't say, "Do you know who I am?" Right? But what he said was, "I completely understand that you guys are concerned that my platform is going to give someone guidance, right? A patient that's calling with a question that may have negative consequences." And so he told me that in response, he and his team flew across the country to that customer, and I think for a couple of weeks. Months.
Yeah.
Every day over lunch with those physicians, showed the physicians exactly how those calls were going to be answered and earn their trust. And I was struck by that. That was several months ago now. But I was struck by that because here's an individual whose engineering accomplishments have had profound impacts on the lives of a variety of people and across a variety of applications, and sort of needs no introduction from that perspective. And yet he took the time and he demonstrated and exhibited enough empathy for those the concerns of those physicians to spend months doing that in order to earn their trust. And I think in order for Silicon Valley to save, or let's say make better the healthcare industry, it's that type of approach that I think is required. Because look, healthcare is special, right?
Everybody's a snowflake, though.
Exactly.
It makes it really hard.
Exactly.
Sort of inherent in what you said is Silicon Valley is going to contribute some component to making healthcare better. Yep. The corollary is healthcare has to make healthcare better. So if you were going to have dinner with the CEO of a large health system who was flailing, trying to figure out how do they reduce the cost of delivering services but yet find a way to dare I say, delight patients that are coming to them for care. What kind of advice, where does somebody start?
We are focused on identifying technologies, software specifically, that provide provider organizations with operational leverage. And that's for a couple of reasons, not the least of which relate to the downstream consequences associated with some uplift or some, free time for the nurses or for the physicians that's freed up because they've adopted a technology platform that renders them more efficient. So if you think about it, and the list is rather long: improved patient experience, right? Improved operating margins, not to be too finance oriented, but improved margins for the provider organization, reduced burnout on the part of clinical personnel, right? Presumably higher retention of said clinical personnel, right? The list continues to go on. And so if I were to humbly submit some advice to an executive at a large hospital health system, it would be to try and identify low-hanging fruit, not to use an overused term from an operational perspective, because I think it's difficult to understate the downstream consequences associated with solving even a couple of simple things with technology or otherwise, strategically, right, operationally, from a process perspective, et cetera. It's hard to understate the downstream consequences, and the impacts that those can be rather profound, in my opinion.
Right. How do you define success for your career? And I guess where I'm getting at is, Cobus and I have both said that we'll know that Syllable will have made it when our mothers no longer have to call us to figure out how to navigate the healthcare system. Because he has an elderly mom and father in South Africa, so he not only has to deal with what every child of an aging parent has to deal with, but he has to do it over huge geographic distances. And my mom's 91 years of age. She lives outside of Philadelphia, and all the kids. I mean, they're kids within 90 minutes of her, but still, for her to even get an appointment with her primary care physician, sometimes it's why aren't they picking up the phone? Why can't I get an appointment today when I want it? They sent me something about this patient portal, and I don't understand it. And so we said, if we can make it easy for them and they can understand how to use it, then we will have succeeded. For TCV or for you personally, what does success look like?
Two answers, both are specific to me. The first, and I'll use a portfolio company, a recent investment in a company called BenchSci as an example. Really what I'm focused on is supporting the entrepreneurs, management teams, and companies that solve something profound from an ROI for the industry perspective. And so to use BenchSci as an example, if over the next handful of years, the use of BenchSci's software applications renders the process of experimentation in the context of sort of broader drug discovery, drug development, more productive, such that it brings novel medicines to market faster, that in my mind is pretty darn fulfilling. The other one is a little potentially softer, and that is, human beings run software companies. And in my mind, what I find particularly rewarding, exhilarating about my job is really partnering and helping support to the extent that I can, and my firm can with our resources and relationships, entrepreneurs like yourself and Cobus and other executives. And by the way, that's inside our portfolio and outside, because I believe rather strongly having a needle-moving impact by supporting a technology company or a collection of them in solving some of the critical problems within this industry. And in particular, really building those relationships, right? Because it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It can be one company to the next and so forth, is what I really find one of the more rewarding aspects of my job.
One of the things that I like to talk to investors about is having come to quote-unquote Silicon Valley and become a bit of a student of the history. This is one industry that likes to lionize people and create celebrities, or either positive celebrity stories or negative celebrity stories. And it seems to the origin stories, the amazing stories of biographies of founders and even of famous venture capitalists to me, it almost does a disservice. It's almost a marketing disservice for what really happens, beneath the surface. Because you read an origin story for, an Intel or a Fairchild Semiconductor, and it sounds like it's a mission to Mars. And you don't hear anything between the origin story and either the IPO or the origin story and the flame out. So what's like the hard work the sort of that part of the business that doesn't really get the spotlight?
Yeah, I'll answer maybe in one or two ways.
I mean, do you sort of understand what I'm asking?
I do, and maybe specific to healthcare is probably a good example. So oftentimes founders and potentially even entire management teams that develop software or technology for the healthcare industry, they usually have either one or the other, but usually not both, as it relates to technology expertise or healthcare industry expertise. And so in a lot of instances, a lot of the hard work as a healthcare investor is I try really hard to have both. I'll never be flawless in either direction, but oftentimes a lot of the hard work is we have a founder. They are highly credible in the provider segment. As one example, they're a physician by training. Perhaps they've consulted the industry for several years. They know it cold, right? But as it relates to scaling a technology company, there are things, particularly if they're a first-time founder, that we work hard to help them either see around corners or get up to speed more quickly in terms of scaling a technology company. And the reverse is actually true, right? Where we have a founder and a management team that from a technology perspective is world-class, and they're bold enough to take on a couple of challenges or a challenge in the healthcare industry, and we try and arm them and surround them with the resources from a healthcare perspective that will sort of reduce the friction as they really attack the industry from a technology perspective. I think the other thing, and this sort of goes to the ways in which we try and support our portfolio companies. And again, humbly, we won't be flawless in doing this, but we'll try to be. In a lot of instances, let's use pharma as an example. The end market is knowable, meaning top 20, top 30, top 50. There's only 50 of them, max, right, as it relates to big pharma. And I think when a company has really nailed something, we do a lot of hard work to accelerate their go-to-market. And I realize Tom is standing over there, so hopefully he heard that. Yeah. But in reality, we do that particularly in healthcare. Selling to healthcare is just so darn hard, even if you've accomplished something from a technology perspective that's rather remarkable and important. We do a lot of hard work to try and accelerate things from a go-to-market perspective in that respect. Does that help answer your question?
It does, very much so. It's fascinating to me because, for instance, we were all at dinner together last night, and I was sitting next to the leadership team from one of your other portfolio companies, and I said, "What did you like about TCV?" And they said, "Well, they just put the right people in place, and they're not too hands-on." So I think that
they didn't say me.
Not you. No, they said you were wonderful and you were providing tons of guidance on a regular basis, and clearly you were working hard for them. But
that's because I was right there.
Yeah, that's right.
Exactly.
No, but I what that belied to me was, in addition to doing what you just described, which is providing support and being able to provide leadership and expertise in areas where the management team may not have it, you're also smart enough to recognize when you put a management team in place or you invest in a management team that you believe in, you're not going to try to micromanage them. You're going to believe in what they can do, and your job is to add a little fertilizer to it where they might be a little deficient in a nutrient.
I mean, look, I can't tell Paul Joyner anything about product management. Nothing. Won't try. What is interesting, and actually that dinner came on the heels of we spent the entire afternoon with that management team talking about, there's the blocking and tackling associated with getting after a roadmap, right? But we spent the entire afternoon talking about what I would consider sort of medium and long-term product opportunities. And, I I sort of sat there quietly with my hands folded and took a handful of notes. But, where I try and be helpful is one of them that came up was real world data, right? And some of the challenges associated with, we have an EMR, using EMR data for those applications, everything from labeling to tokenization. And, I'm sitting there quietly, but all the while, the notes that I was taking were people that I could introduce that leadership team to that had solved that problem before, perhaps in a different circumstance and for a different application or use case. But those are the ways in which, we try and be helpful, right? Another one was workforce management, human capital management, staffing, so on and so forth. That's a category that, horizontally speaking, TCV is invested in. And so some of the notes that I took were, hey, we can introduce you to X individual who's done workforce management and compliance. We can introduce you to this individual who can help you build staffing optimization models, right? Or help you get up the curve incrementally and see around some of those corners. And so, again, going back to the Paul Joyner comment, I can't tell Rick Farr how to scale a service and delivery and support organization, and I will never try to. But it is on the periphery areas like those where we try and help support those leaders.
The thing that's really struck me is the power of the network. I was never a good networker. I mean, from the very beginning, my parents were like, "Oh, you need to reach out. Make sure you develop your network and you establish your network." And they were always trying to introduce me to people that they knew. And I was stubborn and sort of saying, "I need to do this on my own, guys. I can't. I want to be able to develop this on my own." And when you're a physician, we're not trained to develop a network. Our network is the people we refer to. It's within the industry. It's not thinking about who else can help me do something slightly different. So I've really become impressed with how powerful this notion of networking really is in this environment. But let's shift gears for a minute, because I want to talk about patients and I want to talk about patient experience. So one of the things that I really love about my job is working with our own employees to talk about, the impact of our work isn't just the value of our stock. The impact of our work isn't the number of customers we have. The value in our work is that we're actually, if we do it right, it's going to make an impact on a patient. And whether you know it or not, you either are a patient or you're going to be a patient or you've got a loved one who has been a patient. So there's been a lot of discussion about consumerization in health. And this question of, does patient equal consumer? If not, what's the difference? Or if it is, what's the impediment to really treating them like a consumer? What are your thoughts?
I was thinking, actually on the way over here, and I think about this quite a bit. I think a lot about the potential for success as it relates to horizontal technology platforms in healthcare. And one that comes to mind that's relevant, that's trying to make inroads and has had some success in doing so in the industry is Salesforce. And one of the things that's interesting is, if you look, and I'm kind of a geek, so excuse me, or forgive me rather, if you look at the architecture of a typical Salesforce instance, it's an account with contacts and leads and sales opportunities, and the list goes on, right? And for healthcare, it's a patient with insurance or some other mechanism for paying, with a family that has visited other provider organizations that may or may not be affiliated with the one using the system. It's entirely different, right? And so one of the interesting things is there needs to be a way for provider organizations to have relationships with patients, that are longitudinal in nature. A couple of barriers to that, some of which are obvious, some of which are a little bit beneath the surface, right? But if I think about what I want out of the healthcare, my experience with the healthcare system, what I really want is some continuity as it relates to, this is my physician, this is where I fill prescriptions, this is my pharmacy. If necessary, this is my behavioral health, support system, therapist, psychiatrist, what have you. This is my physical therapist, this is my dentist. And I want all those constituents working together. And as it relates to barriers to having that happen, there are a number of them, right? One of them, and this is actually one of our big focus areas, is facilitating data sharing across all of those constituents where necessary. And in a HIPAA compliant fashion, of course. And there are a number of friction points associated with achieving that, but I think that would probably be a good first step, right? As it relates to, as the patient, my information, again, where necessary, being readily available and accessible with my consent
Right.
across the continuum of care. Because I think that is sort of a foundational element as it relates to treating patients, consumers, holistically.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. Have you ever had an exceptional care experience?
Ooh. You know who I think does a really good job is some of these emerging diagnostic companies, frankly, that, offer things that are not necessarily PCR tests.
Yeah.
And what a remarkable experience some of them offer, right? As it relates to shipping it to your home. Of course, there are companies now that are doing in-home diagnostics, like from an equipment perspective, right? But, the notion that there's a 48-hour turnaround time and I don't necessarily have to leave my New York apartment to have that test administered, and it's on a mobile app. And, oh, by the way, that app is interoperable with the Clear app that we use to be compliant with this conference, right? Is rather remarkable. I think experiences like that are going to continue to not necessarily disrupt, but that's going to become the standard as people begin to have more of those experiences, rather delightful actually, with the healthcare system. It's going to become pertinent in other areas, I guess is the punchline.
The thing that I really like about that example is it dovetails really nicely with a conversation I had with Anita, one of your colleagues, Anita Promota, who's on another episode of the podcast. And I was talking to her about the concern that healthcare has around automation and the use of automation, particularly around what we do in conversational AI. So many times, actually every sale I can think of, somebody on the health system side says, I'm not sure our patients are going to like talking to a computer.
Yep.
Or I don't know if they're going to like to talk, or they make the statement.
Yep.
They're not going to like talking to a robot.
Yep.
And Anita has a really neat take on it. She's like, what they're talking about is empathy, right? They don't think that a human being will be able to, or that a robot will have empathy or generate empathy with a human being. Yep. And healthcare is stuck in this person-to-person. The only way you can generate empathy and brand is through a human-to-human connection. But what she says is that time's more important. And exactly to your point, you didn't even have to go to the post office to pick the damn thing up. You didn't have to go to Duane Reade and get the test. It got delivered to your house. So you had the quote unquote gift of time where all you had to do was put in an order and everything else took care of itself. And I think that, to me, one of the things that healthcare has to look at, and maybe it's too fuzzy an idea, but it's the whole issue of how do we give back time to patients. And would you rather spend 15 minutes on hold or talking to a call center operator who can't figure out where to transfer you to, or would you rather talk to a robot that gives you the answer that you need within seconds or transfers you to the appropriate place 100% of the time accurately?
Look, there are a number of considerations, frankly, like the one we talked about with the physicians being concerned about negative consequences associated with syllable answering the phone. I think, and maybe this is a sarcastic comment, it's said in jest, but would those constituents rather have their patients, not have their calls answered, or rather have their calls, be answered and then be abandoned, or they get redirected to the wrong place, or they've called the wrong place in the first place and they have no idea that they did so.
Right.
So I understand it, and I agree with Anita's perspective. But by the same token, to your giving people time back, it's really about getting it right the first time to the extent that that's achievable through automation.
Right.
And I don't know that that'll ever be the case 100% of the time. Everyone's their own individual, right? And has their own needs and circumstances. And so perhaps 100% is not achievable, but wow. I mean, going back to the operational leverage point, think about the leverage that could be achieved if 40% is achievable.
Exactly. And for the people who want it. I mean, you're right. You're never going to get rid of somebody. You're never going to be able to get humans completely out of the loop. And in fact, Cobus makes a really nice point of we want to put humans in the loop because the loop can be improved with human interaction. It's just how do you do that appropriately at the level that's appropriate for the human being to be involved.
Two anecdotes that just came to mind as it relates to calling the healthcare system in particular. In New York City, I have a terrific doctor and terrific sort of physician's office as a primary care physician. every single person that calls that office, the receptionist answers the phone and immediately says, "Can you please hold?"
Right.
Because they're completely overburdened. And the same can be said next time you go to CBS. You'll listen over the loudspeaker and it says one pharmacy call or multiple pharmacy calls, right? And those are from patients with questions about their prescriptions, when they're going to be available, the list goes on. And if you look, I really feel for the pharmacists when I'm in that environment and that is going on, because they are completely overburdened. And the notion that over the loudspeaker someone is reminding them that someone's waiting on them, you can see adds to their really angst and frustration. And so for Syllable in particular, well, I think that there's an opportunity across both those categories, to put it that way.
Do you think some process improvement guru convinced the pharmacy to announce those calls waiting over the loudspeaker to try to get the pharmacist to work harder?
Yeah, either that or a comedian that was looking
right.
for, some situation to put them in.
Right.
But yeah, it's a tricky, the pharmacy in particular is a tricky care setting from an operational perspective across multiple dimensions.
Last couple of questions.
Yeah.
Why do you come to a conference like this? What are you looking to achieve?
2 points. The first is, frankly, it's rather good to be in person with folks again. In fact, I was sort of outside waiting for the exhibit hall to open. There are a number of people hugging. And when was the last time, forget being at a conference, when was the last time people were at a conference like hugging, folks that are in the same industry as they are, that they have relationships with, and a lot of these folks haven't seen each other in 2 years in this capacity, right? And so it's great to be back in person with folks. Obviously, there's really no substitute for it in my opinion. The second is, again, optimist by nature. I often leave these types of events both re-energized, but also hopeful, in the sense that, again, technology investor, right? But in the sense that there are hundreds of people here trying to pursue complex, massive problems for the industry that represents, a sixth or a fifth of GDP.
Right.
Some of which are doing so, are trying to do so through technology. And so really it's, when I get back to the ranch, it's really re-energizing to have had this experience and a set of conversations like the ones we had over dinner. And also really renders me, hopeful as it relates to the potential for this industry. Last
Question that I like to ask all the investors.
Yeah.
Again, because of what I've learned in the 2.5 years that I've been here, what I've observed. So there's a ton of money coming into this space. And if I look outside of digital health, there's 10 tons of money coming in that venture investors are not manipulating, that they're bringing in from limited partners, and then they're investing. Yep. And valuations of companies are exploding for companies that have no to little revenue or have minimal product development. Yep. Some of them make it, most of them don't, from my understanding. How is this whole dance between entrepreneurs and investors and consumers, is it really going to move the ball forward, or is it just about generating wealth for a bunch of investors?
So I aim for the former.
Yep.
To state the obvious. I think, look, as an investor looking at this category, let's put valuations aside for a second, because multiples go up and down. And to a certain extent, that's outside of my control in most instances. What I would say is this: we focus as an organization on product and on customer ROI and as derivative value proposition, and then customer delight. And if you get those things right, and you feel really strongly as it relates to the pain points, problem statements that those companies are addressing, and you also believe that their opportunities are significant from an addressable market perspective, then those are typically good, I don't like the term bets, but those are typically good propositions from an investment perspective. As it relates to the dance, I guess I would say the following. In my humble opinion, there continue to be entrepreneurs that are looking for partners and not just access to capital. And, like we talked about as it relates to some of the ways that I try and support the management teams and entrepreneurs that are in our portfolio and outside our portfolio, if that is your approach, I continue to find that there are opportunities to invest in folks that are looking for that form of partnership. So maybe coming back to your question, things have evolved and will continue to evolve from a fundraising perspective. But I find if I sort of stick to that approach, and I'm genuine in pursuing it, that there will be investment opportunities that are highly attractive to partner with management teams and highly innovative technology companies.
Awesome. Joe Blundo, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
All righty. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Whew. How's that?
Nice job.
How's that?
That was awesome.